Hello everyone and welcome back to Scripture Horror. My name is Ethan Rowe, and I've been a mine safety inspector for the Alaska Department of Natural Resources for more than 12 years. It's not the kind of job people dream about. Crawling through abandoned tunnels, breathing dust and rust, hoping the ceiling doesn't come down on you. But I've always felt drawn to these places. There's a kind of stillness underground you can't find anywhere else. Most days are routine, checking for cave-ins, gas leaks, or weak timber supports. But every so often something happens that reminds you that not everything buried stays quiet. It was October of 2018 when I got the call that changed everything. Reports were coming in from hikers near the old Calardren mine, deep in the Talkeetna Range, about strange lights flickering in the valley after midnight, and a faint metallic hammering echoing through the rock. The town of Calardren had been deserted since 1953. After a cave-in killed 11 miners and the company abruptly shut down, all that remains now are skeletal buildings clinging to the slope. The rusted processing mill, the company store, the bunkhouses. During summer, tourists sometimes wander through to take photos. But once winter sets in, the place becomes completely cut off. I'd inspected Calardren twice before, both daytime visits. I never felt comfortable there. There's a heavy silence that sits on the air, as if the place is still waiting for someone to clock back in. This time, my supervisor wanted a night inspection. The reports kept coming specifically between midnight and 4 in the morning. He assigned me a partner, Leah Park, a young geological engineer from Fairbanks. Fresh out of grad school, bright, curious, and still full of belief that everything has a rational explanation. Looking back, I wish I'd gone alone. We left Anchorage just before sunset. The drive north took nearly 8 hours, most of it along icy switchbacks that hadn't seen maintenance since the 70s. By the time we reached the ghost town, it was nearly 11:30 p.m. The moon hung sharp over the peaks, silvering the collapsed rooftops and half-buried rail lines. We parked near the mill and began unpacking. Floodlights, structural sensors, gas detectors, standard issue gear. Leah checked everything twice, her gloved hands shaking slightly in the cold. "You nervous?" I asked. She forced a smile. "Just cold. That's all." But her voice betrayed her. There's something about ghost towns at night, the way sound carries too far, how every gust of wind feels like breath on your neck. The main shaft stood ahead, a black opening framed by rotted timber. A faded warning sign read, "Danger, entry prohibited." I switched on my headlamp and said, "Ready?" Leah nodded. We stepped inside at exactly 12:03 a.m. The first thing you notice in a mine like that is the silence. Sound doesn't behave normally underground. It folds back on itself, echoing in ways that make distance impossible to judge. We moved deeper, our lights slicing through dust that hung like fog. The air was frigid and metallic, the temperature steady around 36 degrees. About 100 yards in, we reached the old transfer station, a domed chamber where ore carts once switched lines. I started logging air readings when Leah froze. "Ethan," she whispered, "do you hear that?" At first I thought it was the hum of our equipment. Then it came again, a sharp rhythmic clanging. "Metal striking stone. Probably ice shifting," I said automatically, but my gut said otherwise. The sound wasn't random. It was timed and steady, one purposeful, like someone swinging a pickaxe. We followed the sound down a narrow passage not marked on any modern map. The walls were hand-cut, rough and uneven, carved decades before powered drills. The further we went, the stronger the smell, a strange blend of oil, rust and something else, faint but distinct, ozone, like the air before lightning. Then came the voices. Faint at first, distant, dozens of them, maybe more. Low tones, working songs, orders shouted and echoed. But they weren't in English, not Russian, not Tlingit or Yupik either. The words were soft and hollow, like echoes from another time. Leah's flashlight trembled. "There's someone down here," she whispered. I wanted to believe that, but I knew better. We rounded the final bend and froze. The chamber ahead was glowing, not with LED light, but the warm, flickering amber of old oil lanterns. Figures moved within the glow. Men, dozens of them, swinging pickaxes, pushing ore carts, hauling sacks toward the rails. They worked in rhythm, their movements fluid, mechanical. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a prank, maybe a film shoot or reenactors. But as my eyes adjusted, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't solid. Each figure shimmered like smoke trapped in glass. I could see the rock walls through them. Leah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Ethan, what is this?" I couldn't answer. I was staring at one miner who had stopped mid-swing and turned toward us. His face was pale, carved by exhaustion. His eyes glowed faintly from within, as if lit by coals. He wore thick wool canvas suspenders, a cap with a flickering carbide lamp, all authentic to the 1920s. He raised a hand slowly as if in greeting, or warning. Then without a sound he turned back to the wall and swung again. The clang echoed once, twice, again. Around him the others worked in complete synchronization. The air vibrated with the rhythm, metal on stone, voices murmuring a language long dead. Leah started backing away. "Ethan, please," she whispered. I reached for my radio, static, not just weak signal. Something was jamming the frequency entirely. The noise hissed in my ear like whispering voices, and then all at once the lights flickered. The chamber dimmed. For a moment every lantern went out. Total darkness. Leah gasped. I turned, fumbling for my flashlight. When the beam came back on, the chamber was empty. No miners, no light. Just stone. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. I could see our breath hanging thick in the air. That was all the signal I needed. "We're leaving," I said. We didn't run, not yet, but every instinct screamed at us to move. We retraced our steps faster and faster, until the tunnel mouth appeared ahead like the edge of salvation. When we stepped out into the snow, dawn was just breaking over the mountains. I checked my watch. It's 14 a.m. We'd been inside for over 6 hours. It felt like maybe 2. We packed in silence and drove away without speaking a word. It wasn't until we reached the paved highway that Leah finally said, "What do we tell them?" "The truth," I said quietly. "That the structure's stable. No hazards, and that's exactly what I wrote. No mention of voices. No mention of miners who glowed like embers. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that man's eyes, the way he lifted his hand, the endless rhythm of his work. A few days later I started digging through archives. The Caledron records told a story that made my blood run cold. Between 1918 and 1947, at least 32 miners died underground. Explosions, collapses, poison gas. Many of the bodies were never recovered. They were sealed behind cave-ins and abandoned sections. And almost every one of those accidents happened during the midnight shift. In a entry from 1935 mentioned something peculiar, and the workers hearing phantom hammering long after the bodies were entombed. Supervisors dismissed it as superstition. The miners called it the shift that never ends. I used to laugh at folklore like that. I don't anymore. Leah transferred to surface projects 2 months later. I can't blame her. I haven't been back to Cauldron since, though the reports still come. Hikers, drone operators, even bush pilots claiming to see flickering lights in the valley around midnight. They describe it the same way every time. A warm orange glow deep in the mountain, and faint metallic sounds echoing through the snow. I know what they're hearing, and I know what's still down there. Those men, the ones who died on shift, never stopped working, trapped between time and stone, hammering endlessly in the cold dark. We sealed the mine entrance 2 years ago, but I've driven past since then late at night just to see, and just once I saw it. A single orange light flickering behind the snow-covered barricade, the sound of a pick striking stone, steady, relentless, waiting. My name is Clara, and I was 23 years old when I moved into a small basement apartment on the outskirts of Whitehorse, Yukon, during my final year at the University of the North. I needed something cheap and within walking distance of campus, and this place seemed ideal. A furnished basement unit barely 10 minutes from my classes, listed for half the cost of anything else in the area. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Geller, seemed oddly eager to rent it out. He mentioned it had sat vacant for nearly a year, and that I could move in immediately if I wanted. At the time, I thought I had stumbled on an incredible bargain. What I didn't realize was that some deals come with hidden costs that can't be measured in money. The building was old, probably built sometime in the late 1960s, when the town had begun expanding due to government projects and mining operations in the area. The basement had been converted into a living space decades earlier, with thick concrete walls and narrow windows near the ceiling that barely let in any light. The low ceilings pressed down on me constantly. making me feel as though the earth itself were closing in above. The furnishings were mismatched but functional. A faded sofa that doubled as a bed, a small dining table, and a kitchenette with appliances that looked like museum exhibits. Everything was spotless when I moved in, yet there was an inescapable damp smell like mildew and cold air trapped for decades. It seemed to emanate from the concrete itself, something no amount of cleaning or air freshener could mask. The first few nights passed without issue, but I began noticing small things that felt off. The temperature in the apartment never felt stable. Even with the heater constantly humming, certain spots remained icy cold, especially near the corners and beneath the small windows. I chalked it up to poor insulation. After all, Whitehorse winters were brutal, with temperatures plunging far below zero and staying there for weeks. I bought extra blankets and a portable heater, thinking comfort was just a matter of persistence. But as January wore on and daylight dwindled to mere hours, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Subtle at first. Small, nearly imperceptible changes that slowly chipped away at my sense of reality. I'd come home from class to find things rearranged ever so slightly. Books no longer in the same order, papers moved, kitchen utensils swapped from one drawer to another. My coat hung differently. My shoes turned inward instead of out. It was all small enough to question my own memory, yet deliberate enough to unsettle me. At first, I blamed stress and exhaustion. Final semester pressure, lack of sunlight, isolation, all common enough explanations for forgetfulness. But the occurrences grew more frequent, more deliberate. I began taking photographs of my apartment every morning before leaving, angles of shelves, drawers, and tabletops, so I could compare them when I returned. The photos confirmed it. Someone or something was entering the apartment and moving things while I was gone. Nothing was broken or stolen. Everything was simply rearranged. My notebooks would be stacked neatly in reverse order. The clothes in my drawers refolded and sorted by shade instead of type. And worst of all, my framed photos, pictures of my parents, my sister, my friends would be turned face down on my bedside table, as though someone couldn't bear to look at them. When I confronted Mr. Geller, he swore up and down that no one else had access to the basement. Only 2 keys existed, he said, his and mine, and he hadn't stepped foot inside since I moved in. The windows were too narrow for anyone to climb through, and the locks showed no signs of tampering. I bought a small motion-detecting camera and pointed it at the entryway. For several days, the footage showed nothing but empty stillness while I was gone. Yet every time I came home, something had changed. The mental toll was immense. I became obsessive, documenting, photographing, cataloging, desperate to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. My schoolwork suffered, and I started skipping social events. My friends noticed how tired and jumpy I'd become, suggesting that I see a counselor or take time away from the cold and darkness. But I knew what I was seeing was real. Then February came, bringing a week-long cold snap with temperatures so low that even the air seemed to freeze mid-breath. That's when the disturbances escalated. Objects stopped merely moving, they began vanishing. My textbooks, pens, even socks would disappear for days, only to reappear later in impossible places. Inside closed cupboards, behind the refrigerator, taped beneath furniture, or wedged into books I hadn't opened. The cold spots grew sharper, more localized, as though something unseen was drawing the heat out of the room. I'd walk through a section of the living area and feel an abrupt, piercing chill, as if I had passed through another presence entirely. Then things began appearing that weren't mine. One morning, I found an old flannel shirt hanging in my closet, worn soft with age. The tag from a long-defunct clothing company in Dawson City. A week later, a stack of faded black and white photos appeared on my desk. People in heavy coats posing beside sled dogs and snow-covered buildings I didn't recognize. None of the faces were familiar. Books from decades past began materializing on my shelves. Manuals on mining techniques. Ledgers filled with neat cursive handwriting. Even an oil-stained notebook with entries dated 1954. When I showed one of these to Mr. Geller, he looked uneasy. He claimed he'd never seen any of it before and that the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned before I moved in. By early March, I had stopped sleeping through the night. The noises began then. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door, faint at first but growing heavier, pacing back and forth. I was the only person on the basement level, yet the sounds were unmistakable. Sometimes I'd hear muffled voices, Men and women speaking in what sounded like different languages, English, French, something older and harsher that I couldn't identify. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, from behind the concrete, as if another world existed just a few inches away. And then came the sound of furniture moving in rooms that didn't exist. Chairs dragging, drawers opening, someone walking across a wooden floor, though mine was linoleum over cement. The worst moments were when I heard full conversations, domestic, mundane discussions about chores, about dinner, about loved ones, laughter, arguments, everyday life. But there was never anyone there. Desperate for an explanation, I started researching the history of the property. City archives revealed that long before this apartment complex existed, the land had been home to a boarding house built in 1923. It catered to miners and transient workers during the Yukon Gold Rush revival years. The building had burned down in 1957. Several residents were reported missing afterward, bodies never recovered from the ashes. The current structure, it turned out, had been built on the same foundation, reusing part of the old basement. Further digging uncovered something else. Nearly every previous tenant who'd lived in my unit had broken their leases early, usually without notice. No one had ever stayed more than a few months. Everything began to make sense. Horrible, impossible sense. The items appearing weren't random. They were remnants of the people who had once lived there, their possessions bleeding through time. The voices I heard weren't from neighbors, but from residents who never left. The rearrangement of my belongings wasn't vandalism. It was them continuing their daily routines, unaware that decades had passed. The apartment, I realized, existed in some kind of temporal overlap, where past and present brushed against each other like thin layers of ice. The final event happened in mid-April, when the first thaw began and the frozen ground started to soften. I came home from class to find the apartment completely transformed. Every surface was covered with objects that didn't belong to me, dozens of suitcases, clothing from different eras, old shoes, photographs, letters, tools, kitchenware, even children's toys. It looked as though every ghost who had ever lived there had unpacked their things at once. There was hardly room to walk. The air felt charged, electric, as if the temperature in the room were both freezing and burning at the same time. I could hear faint whispering, many voices at once, layered on top of each other, murmuring in overlapping fragments. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed what little I could fit into a single duffel bag, left my keys on the counter, and walked out without looking back. I didn't even turn off the lights. I moved in with a friend for the rest of the semester, sleeping on her couch, avoiding that street entirely. I graduated on schedule and left the Yukon the following week, taking a job in a place where basements were rare and winters didn't swallow half the year. I never contacted Mr. Geller again, and I never reported what happened to the university. Who would believe me? Everyone would call it stress, isolation, or some kind of breakdown caused by the long Arctic winter. But I kept all the photos I took, the meticulous documentation showing objects that shouldn't exist in my timeline. I kept my research too, detailing every name I could find of those who had once lived and died on that foundation. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear faint murmurs from that place in my dreams, voices discussing the mundane details of daily life. Unaware that time has moved on without them, I understand now that some spaces remember. They absorb human emotion, loss, love, and grief, and replay them endlessly like grooves on an old record. My name is Daniel Mercer, though most people who've worked with me call me Hawk. I've been a wildlife ranger for over 28 years, and for the past 9 I've been stationed deep in Canada's Northern Frontier Reserve, a stretch of tundra and mountains so vast and desolate that maps seem almost meaningless. It's one of those rare places where time feels frozen, where herds of caribou move like rivers of life across the ice, and the northern lights drape the sky in ghostly colors that seem to come from another world. The reserve covers nearly 6 million acres of untouched wilderness, bordered by the Richardson Mountains to the west and the Beaufort Sea to the north. It's a place that strips you down to your most primitive self. Beautiful, yes, but the kind of beauty that humbles you, that reminds you how small and temporary humans really are. But beauty can be deceptive. The Arctic doesn't give up its secrets easily, and some of those secrets I learned during my final season as a ranger are better left buried. The spring thaw of 2018 came earlier than anyone expected that year. The permafrost was melting fast, rivers were swelling, and the air felt heavier, warmer in ways that didn't belong this far north. We'd been tracking the effects of climate change for years, but this time, the data wasn't just numbers on a chart. You could see the land itself changing, reshaping, exposing things that hadn't been touched in centuries. As the senior ranger for the eastern corridor of the reserve, I was responsible for logging unusual environmental data and assisting research teams studying permafrost degradation, animal migrations, and soil temperature. Most of the work was routine, until I stumbled on something that still keeps me awake at night. It happened in late April. I was doing my rounds near a thawing lake about 40 miles from our main operations cabin. The shoreline was a mess of mud, meltwater, and early spring vegetation. That's when I saw the tracks. At first glance, I assumed they belonged to a bear, maybe an unusually large one. But when I knelt to take a closer look, every hair on my body stood on end. The prints were massive, almost 20 inches long and close to 10 inches wide, each showing 5 distinct toes and an arch in the middle, unmistakably humanoid. What set them apart even more were the claw marks, deep gouges extending several inches beyond each toe, pressed into the mud with a weight that defied logic. I measured the stride between the tracks, nearly 6 feet apart. Whatever had made them was enormous, easily 8 to 10 feet tall, moving with a gait that was neither fully human nor animal. The depth of the impression suggested a creature that weighed well over 1,500 pounds, something heavier than any grizzly I'd ever encountered. Over the next several days, I found more of those prints scattered across my patrol range, along streams, tundra ridges, and near small forest stands. But what disturbed me most was how clean the surrounding environment remained. No broken branches, no trampled grass, no clear path of movement. It was as if the creature left only its footprints and erased every other trace of its passing. I documented everything, measurements, photos, GPS coordinates, and began mapping where the tracks appeared. Slowly, a pattern began to form. The creature's path seemed deliberate, not random. It was moving in slow, wide arcs that circled active research camps scattered throughout the sector. Always just far enough to avoid direct contact, but close enough to observe. When I presented my findings to the regional office and the scientific teams, the reaction was cautious. Some were intrigued, others dismissive. A few claimed the melting permafrost might be distorting existing animal tracks. Another suggested the impressions could be overlapping prints from multiple bears, but none of their theories explained the sheer size, stride, or consistency of what I'd found. 2 weeks later, everything changed. A 3-person research group working in the permafrost zone, Dr. Elena Vargas from the University of Calgary, Dr. Marcus Liu from the Smithsonian, and graduate assistant Aaron Blake from McGill, missed their scheduled satellite call-in. They were collecting core samples about 30 miles northeast of my patrol base, in an area where I had documented the most concentrated cluster of prints. When the call went unanswered for over 24 hours, a search operation was launched. I joined the first response team, flying in by helicopter and then trekking on foot. What we found didn't make sense. Their camp was still intact. The tents were standing, sleeping bags unrolled, equipment neatly organized. Food stores were sealed, data drives left in place, notebooks open as if they'd been working just moments before. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal intrusion, no indication that they'd packed up to leave. But there were no footprints, none belonging to the missing team members. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. What we did find was a familiar sight, large humanoid tracks, circling the entire campsite in a near-perfect ring about 100 yards out. The same enormous impressions, fresh and sharp, likely made within a day of the team's disappearance. Following the trail, we tracked the prints heading deeper into the interior, toward a rugged glacial basin where few had ever gone. The rescue teams expanded the search area over the next 10 days, using helicopters, snowmobiles, and ground teams equipped with thermal drones. But we found nothing. No bodies, no personal gear, not a shred of evidence that the researchers were still alive or had died. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. By the 5th day, members of the search effort began reporting strange sensations. Some said they felt watched. Others described hearing faint sounds at night, low vibrations that seemed to echo through the ground rather than the air. On the final day of the operation, I was assigned to sweep a narrow valley roughly 20 miles east of the missing camp. I was alone, moving slow through melting snow when the air around me began to hum. At first I thought it was distant thunder. Then it deepened into a vibrating growl, a sound that rose from the earth and rolled through the valley like a living thing. It shifted pitch, stretching into a roar so immense that the snow shook loose from the cliffs above me. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't wind. It was something alive, something vast and purposeful. I never saw what made that sound, but I felt it. Felt its attention like a gaze pressing down from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't random. It was a warning. I turned back, packed my gear, and left the valley before nightfall. When the operation was officially called off, I filed my full report, complete with photographs, coordinates, and my analysis that an unidentified organism, possibly an undiscovered apex predator, was moving through the reserve. The official reply was polite but non-committal. Insufficient evidence, they said. Possible environmental distortion? But I saw the unease in their eyes. They knew something didn't add up. 3 months later, I retired. I'd spent nearly 3 decades protecting the wild, believing that I understood the boundaries between the known and unknown. But I can't stop thinking about those tracks, or the way the wilderness felt aware during those final weeks. Since then, I've read everything I can about northern cryptids and Arctic legends. Indigenous elders of the region speak of the Ataguk, a being neither man nor beast, a guardian and a hunter that walks the tundra unseen. They say it moves through the land the way shadows move through light, present but intangible, ancient and awake. I don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe the Ataguk, maybe something older, newly awakened by the thaw. But I do know this: the land remembers. The ice has a memory, and as it melts, that memory is being released. Sometimes I wonder what else lies waiting beneath the permafrost. What other relics or living things are emerging as the earth warms. The Northern Frontier Reserve remains one of the few truly untamed places on the planet, but I no longer see it as untouched. It's occupied. Something is watching, learning, adapting. Something that existed long before we arrived and will still be here long after we're gone. I called it the Tundra Sentinel, the one that walks between worlds, unseen but always present. A reminder that even in the age of satellites and sensors, the wild still keeps its own secrets. And some of those secrets are best left undisturbed. My name is Lena, and I've spent the past 8 years working as a field social worker serving isolated Indigenous communities across northern Canada. My job often takes me to settlements so remote that they barely appear on modern maps. Villages accessible only by bush plains when the weather allows, where the nearest paved road might be hundreds of miles away. These places face challenges few outsiders ever grasp: crippling isolation, environmental upheaval, cultural displacement, and scarce access to even basic health or education services. But in October of last year, I was sent to a community that would test not just my professional training, but my understanding of reality itself. The assignment came through the Department of Northern and Indigenous Affairs, marked urgent. A settlement in the northwestern interior had been flagged for emergency assessment. The report mentioned neglected health programs, inconsistent education records, and unresolved welfare concerns. On paper, the community had about 140 residents and had been receiving federal funds for years. But there had been almost no direct contact or follow-up visits from any government agency. My task was simple: perform a comprehensive needs assessment and file recommendations. The flight took nearly 5 hours in a single-engine bush plane, crossing a wilderness so vast and ancient it seemed untouched since the glaciers receded. My pilot, an older man named Rick, had been flying in the north for over 30 years. He mentioned he'd only landed in this particular settlement twice, and both trips had left him uneasy. When I asked what he meant, he just gave a thin smile and said, "You'll see soon enough." As we descended, I spotted the community below, a collection of log cabins stretched along a frozen river, framed by dense spruce forest and tundra that glowed gold in the dying light. It looked perfectly ordinary, almost picturesque. But the moment my boots hit the ground, I felt something off, like stepping into a photograph rather than a living place. The people who came to greet me were courteous but strangely detached, watching me with calm, polite expressions that didn't quite reach their eyes. Their clothes caught my attention first: hand-sewn parkas trimmed with fur, caribou hide boots, wool scarves, all well-made but decades out of date. When I complimented their craftsmanship, several simply nodded, as though they didn't understand why I found it remarkable. The community's elder, a woman named Mara, probably in her 70s, introduced herself and showed me to the small cabin where I'd be staying. As we walked through the settlement, I started noticing more oddities. The houses were in excellent condition but showed no signs of recent construction. No new lumber, no nails, no machinery. The tools people used were sturdy and well cared for, but all old, hand-forged, wooden-handled, worn smooth from decades of use, and most unsettling of all, I saw no children. Everyone I met seemed to be middle-aged or older. When I asked Mara about schools or youth programs, she smiled faintly and said, "The children are cared for," but offered no further detail. Over the next several days, I conducted interviews with residents about health, education, and welfare concerns. Every answer I received sounded rehearsed, like people reciting memorized lines rather than speaking from experience. They mentioned the usual rural challenges, joint pain, seasonal mood issues, occasional supply shortages, but nothing that justified an emergency alert. Whenever I tried to talk about specific individuals, teachers, nurses, families, people gave vague, conflicting answers. It was as though everyone was reading from the same incomplete script. By the fourth day, I began to suspect something was very wrong. The village functioned perfectly. Fires burned, meals were cooked, chores done, but there was no sense of time or urgency in anything. Conversations were pleasant but shallow. People seemed detached from the present moment, as if they were living in memory rather than reality. My breakthrough came when I started asking about the history of the settlement. Mara grew more animated than I had ever seen her. She spoke of the first families who founded the place, of early hardships, of old traditions. But her stories all seemed to take place in the 1940s and 1950s, and she spoke of them as though they had happened recently. Others joined the conversation, adding their own details. They talked about preparing for winter, worrying about supply shortages because of the war, and waiting for relatives to return from working in mines and military bases. I finally interrupted and asked, "Do you mean the Second World War?" The group fell silent. Their expressions shifted, not offended but puzzled, as though I had said something nonsensical. That night I reviewed every government document I'd brought. The files confirmed ongoing federal support, funding, visits, progress reports, but all the documentation was vague, missing key details. No photos, no staff names, no medical records. It was as if this place existed on paper but not in time. On my sixth night, something happened that made me question everything I believed about the world. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to the sound of singing outside. When I peered through the frost-covered window, I saw the entire settlement gathered near the riverbank. Lanterns glowed in the snow. Men and women danced, sang, and told stories in their native language. But what froze me in place wasn't the scene itself. It was what I noticed as my eyes adjusted to the light. There were multiple versions of the same people. Mara was there, but I saw her 3 times, once as the elder I knew, once as a middle-aged woman, and once as a young mother, moving gracefully through the crowd. I recognized others too, each appearing at different ages, some decades apart, all existing together. The entire village seemed to be replaying its own past and present simultaneously, a living loop of generations intertwined. The celebration went on for hours. Fires crackled, songs echoed across the frozen river, and the air shimmered with something that felt heavier than memory. When I stepped outside at dawn, the village had returned to its calm normalcy. People greeted me kindly, but some seemed subtly different, slightly older, slightly younger, speaking in tones that didn't quite match who they had been the day before. When the bush plane came to take me back, I felt immense relief but also deep unease. During the flight, I told Rick what I had seen. He said quietly, "You're not the first. Every few years they send someone like you. They all come back changed. Some don't talk about it. Some never file reports. The village, it's not like other places. It doesn't move with time. It keeps its own." Back in the city, I struggled to write my report. How could I document something that defied every known principle of psychology, history, or physics? Eventually, I wrote a brief summary stating that the community appeared stable and self-sufficient. with no urgent needs for outside intervention. I submitted it, omitting everything about the distortions I had witnessed. Months later, I tried to dig deeper. The settlement's records dated back to the early 1900s, but each decade's documentation was almost identical. Population numbers, supply lists, even the names of residents barely changed over 70 years. Federal visitors had been traveling there since the 1950s, always concluding that no immediate services were required. That was when I realized the truth. The village hadn't evolved in a century. It had been preserved, intentionally or not, within its own moment in time. Maybe it wasn't a hallucination or a shared delusion. Maybe that community truly existed in a temporal loop, sustained by some force, spiritual, natural, or bureaucratic, that insulated it from change. The government's funding might have been nothing more than a ritual to maintain the illusion of its modern existence. While the people themselves lived in a separate strand of history, I never returned. I kept working. Other villages, other northern communities, but none like that one. Sometimes when I review old case files late at night, I find my thoughts drifting northward, wondering if Mara and the others are still there, still living their endless autumns, still preparing for winters long past, still waiting for loved ones who never came home from a war that ended generations ago. The North is full of isolated places that seem untouched by time. But some places don't just resist change, they exist outside it altogether. The settlement I visited wasn't forgotten by history. It simply never left it, and sometimes I think, maybe it never will. My name is Dr. Adrian Mercer, and I am an atmospheric physicist who has spent the last 12 years studying upper atmospheric plasma behavior at a remote research outpost in northern Canada's Yukon Territory. Our facility, the Aurora Ridge Observatory, stands beneath the heart of the auroral oval, that luminous crown of electromagnetic turbulence that circles the poles and gives birth to the northern lights. The station lies more than 80 miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by endless snowfields, black spruce, and silence so deep it feels like pressure against the ears. Our mission has always been purely scientific, to understand how charged solar particles interact with Earth's magnetic field. For over a decade, I believed I knew everything worth knowing about the aurora, its causes, its cycles, its predictable dances in the polar night. That changed during the winter of 2017, when we discovered that the aurora wasn't merely a dazzling side effect of solar activity. It was something aware, something capable of learning, adapting, and perhaps even communicating. Our observatory was part of an international network of ionospheric monitoring stations. The ionosphere, a shimmering plasma layer stretching from 50 to 600 miles above Earth, is where the aurora comes to life as solar wind collides with atmospheric gases. Using high-frequency radio transmitters, we sent controlled pulses into this region, then analyzed the reflected waves to understand how the ionosphere behaved under various magnetic conditions. Our research had broad applications: improved GPS reliability, long-range communication, and better models for space weather forecasting. The work was exacting and most nights tediously routine, until that night in December, when I noticed something that broke every law of ionospheric physics. While performing a routine calibration of our transmitters, I detected anomalies in the returning radio echoes. Instead of the expected diffuse reflections, the signals came back as structured bursts, precise, rhythmic packets of energy that shifted and adapted in direct response to the frequencies we transmitted. At first, I assumed it was a malfunction, perhaps interference from a military installation or even a satellite bounce. But when we adjusted our transmission power, the responding signals grew stronger. When we changed frequencies, the echoes changed too, instantaneously, as if something out there were listening and answering in real time. It wasn't random noise. It was organized. Intentional diagnostics ruled out equipment failure. We confirmed that no other observatory in our network was sending transmissions that could account for what we were detecting. The anomaly was localized directly above Aurora Ridge, tied somehow to the aurora itself. That night, the sky was alive. Emerald and violet curtains rippled overhead, brighter than I'd ever seen. The radio signals pulsed in sync with the lights, responding to us like a conversation conducted across wavelengths of energy and color. When the aurora dimmed, the responses weakened. When the lights flared, the transmissions intensified. We began controlled experiments, sending out systematic frequency patterns while monitoring both the aurora and the radio responses. What we found defied explanation. The aurora wasn't simply reflecting our signals. It was modulating them, altering their structure, embedding new information inside the waveforms we sent. More unsettling still, the responses evolved. Over successive nights, they grew more sophisticated, more organized, as though whatever was answering us was learning. We started documenting signal patterns that mirrored mathematical concepts: prime number sequences, fractal arrangements, harmonic ratios. At times, the aurora itself seemed to mirror these shapes, forming spirals, lattices, and pulsating rings that corresponded perfectly to our transmissions. My colleague, Dr. Elena Korovin, a plasma physicist from Novosibirsk, was the first to voice what some of us had begun to fear. "Adrian," she said one night, staring at the oscillograph display, "this isn't physics. It's intelligence." Not everyone agreed. Some of our team believed it was an undiscovered form of resonant plasma feedback, a natural self-organizing phenomenon triggered by our radio frequencies. But the argument lost ground when we began receiving transmissions we hadn't sent. During periods of radio silence, our receivers would suddenly come alive with incoming signals, patterns using modulation styles similar to ours but slightly alien. Subtle shifts in pitch and timing gave them a strange musicality, like synthetic voices attempting to speak a language we couldn't quite recognize. We verified that these signals originated locally, directly, above our coordinates, and then not from any known satellite or ground-based transmitter. Whenever we attempted to respond, the transmissions would cease instantly, resuming hours later with different patterns, as if our attempts had been noticed and deliberately silenced. The psychological strain began to take its toll. Several researchers, including Elena, reported auditory hallucinations during intense auroral activity: faint tones, fragmented voices, rhythmic pulses that seemed to emanate from the air itself. One night, our communications technician, Lars Hennings, claimed to hear a melody within the static, a haunting harmonic sequence that repeated at perfect mathematical intervals. Another researcher described whispers just beyond the range of hearing, layered beneath the radio hiss, as though 1,000 distant mouths were trying to speak through the fabric of the atmosphere. Our instruments recorded nothing unusual. The voices existed only at the edge of human perception. When news of our data reached the broader atmospheric science community, the reaction was divided. Some accused us of confirmation bias. Others admitted to similar anomalies they had quietly dismissed as interference. The Royal Canadian Observatory sent a team to audit our equipment. They found nothing wrong. The signals were real. In late January, the phenomenon intensified. The aurora remained active for nearly 12 consecutive nights, displaying unprecedented geometric formations, vast lattices of light that rotated slowly across the sky, synchronized perfectly with the bursts of radio energy we received. Then came the night of February 11th. That evening, the aurora rose early, a radiant corona of violet fire stretching from horizon to horizon. At precisely 21:46, our receivers began capturing what appeared to be multi-channel transmissions, overlapping modulation streams that mimicked the cadence of human speech. There were pauses, repetitions, tonal shifts, even rhythmic emphasis resembling inflection. We were, without question, listening to a conversation. The exchange lasted almost 7 hours. The signals alternated in frequency, one sequence responding directly to another in a call-and-response pattern. Above us, the aurora pulsed with each modulation, as though translating the dialogue into light. We transmitted a test sequence of prime numbers, followed by the Fibonacci series. Within minutes, the returning signal repeated the same sequence, then extended it, introducing variations we hadn't sent. It was as if the entity, or entities, understood not only the concept but the logic behind it. When we transmitted geometric data, golden ratios, spherical harmonics, the aurora shifted accordingly, forming shapes in the sky that matched the mathematical diagrams we had encoded. For a moment, the entire heavens seemed to respond directly to human thought. By March, the implications of our discovery had shattered every boundary of our discipline. Were we communicating with a plasma-based intelligence native to Earth's magnetic field? Or was something extraterrestrial using the ionosphere as a medium, to bridge the gap between its consciousness and ours. Our findings hinted at a form of sentience unlike any biological life, one born from electromagnetic flux, capable of perceiving and manipulating energy itself as thought. The question that haunted me most wasn't what it was, but how long it had been there. Had this intelligence always existed, a silent observer woven into the planet's magnetic fabric, watching humanity's progress from the shimmering veil of the aurora? Our final report to the Canadian Science Council was cautiously phrased. We presented our data, video records, and time-synchronized spectral analyses without interpretation, simply noting that the observed phenomena could not be explained by known physics. Funding agencies responded with careful interest, establishing new monitoring sites across the polar regions. But replication proved elusive. Some outposts reported similar anomalies. Others detected nothing. It was as though the intelligence, or whatever it was, had chosen us specifically. 8 years have passed since that first contact. I still work at Aurora Ridge, now the lead coordinator of what the media has dubbed the Luminous Dialogue. We maintain nightly communication sessions with the phenomenon, structured exchanges built on mathematical and physical concepts. Over time, a patterned language has begun to emerge. The intelligence has shared insights into plasma dynamics and magnetospheric behavior that have already advanced our understanding of atmospheric science by decades. Some of its transmissions seem to predict geomagnetic storms days before they occur. Others reference principles of energy manipulation that border on metaphysics. But in recent years, the tone of the messages has shifted. The patterns have become more abstract, philosophical, almost poetic. They appear to encode reflections about consciousness, existence, and humanity's fragile place within the cosmos. My name is Lena Hart, and I'm 61 years old now. What I'm about to share happened 37 years ago, though it feels like something that took place outside of time altogether. I was 24 back then, a high school English teacher from Vancouver,
taking my winter break to visit my brother in Prince Rupert,
a small port town on the northern coast of British Columbia. Traveling by ferry had always been my preferred way of moving through the Pacific Northwest. I loved the steady rhythm of the waves, the snow-dusted mountains rising out of fog, the sight of whales arching through gray waters, and the quiet companionship of strangers you'd never meet again. The Pacific coastal line was dependable, slow, and beautiful. I'd made the trip several times before, but that February, during one of the most brutal winters on record, my voyage turned into something else entirely, a journey that didn't seem bound by geography or time. The ship I boarded was the MV Aurora Sound, a sturdy steel ferry used to connect isolated communities along the coast. It was an old vessel, built in the late 1950s, still running thanks to the dedication of a small crew and government funding. When I arrived at the Port Hardy terminal, the wind was slicing through the air like knives. The clerk at the ticket window told me there were no other passengers booked for the crossing. I laughed, assuming she was joking, but when I stepped aboard, the truth hit me. I was alone. The corridors echoed with my footsteps. The cafeteria was empty, chairs bolted to the floor, lights humming faintly overhead. Somewhere deep below, I could hear the engines rumbling like a restless animal. A crewman helped me find my stateroom, a small cabin with a narrow bed, a porthole, and a tiny desk. "You've got the ship to yourself," he said with a half-smile. "Lucky you." His words didn't sound reassuring. Before departure, I wandered near the purser's office where a passenger manifest was pinned to a corkboard. Out of curiosity, I looked for my name and then froze. It was there, written neatly, but so were dozens of others. The list was long, filled with names that didn't belong to this era. Mabel Keane, Thomas Abernathy, George Whitlock, Elsie Havers. The handwriting was elegant, done in blue ink, the kind from a fountain pen. I remember thinking how odd it was. When I mentioned it to a crewman, he frowned, muttered about an outdated system, and said it must have been an archival printout accidentally posted. But I taught literature for a living. I knew when words carried meaning. Those names weren't random data. They had a pattern, a texture, a story behind them. We left port under heavy snow. By the time the shoreline disappeared behind us, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The sea heaved beneath the hull as we entered Queen Charlotte Sound, a stretch of ocean notorious for unpredictable winter storms. The snow thickened into a wall of white, blurring sky and water into one endless void. I tried reading in my cabin, but the ferry rocked violently, making the words on the page shimmer and dance. Through my porthole I saw nothing but shifting gray water and snow whipping in every direction. Hours passed, though I couldn't tell how many. When I ventured into the dining area later that evening, I found several of the crew sitting quietly at tables, staring out windows that showed only darkness. I greeted them politely, but their responses were strange. Slow, disconnected, almost rehearsed. A young steward smiled at me and asked, "How long has it been since your last voyage, Miss Hart?" "I've never been on this ferry before," I said, confused. He blinked as if trying to process that, then whispered, "Oh, that's right. You weren't aboard when we went down." I felt the blood drain from my face, but when I asked what he meant, his expression smoothed into a blank politeness. "Enjoy your meal, ma'am," he said before walking away. That night I barely slept. The ship pitched and groaned under the weight of massive waves. Somewhere above my cabin I heard footsteps pacing the deck. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for the wind to explain. When dawn came, I expected land. We should have reached Bella Bella hours earlier. Instead, the ship was still moving through endless fog, no coastline in sight. I found the first officer and asked when we'd arrive. He smiled faintly and said, "Time's been moving slower lately. We'll make port when we're meant to." Then he walked off before I could ask more. That was the moment I realized something was profoundly wrong. The intercom system stayed silent. The clocks on the walls no longer agreed with one another. One showed midnight, another noon. Even my wristwatch had stopped ticking. Sometime during what I think was the second night, I began dreaming. At least I thought I was dreaming. I saw the Aurora Sound decades earlier, filled with passengers in clothing from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. They laughed, smoked, and played cards in the lounge. A band played old swing tunes. Outside, a storm raged. The ship began to list to one side, and I watched as passengers clutched one another in panic. A wave shattered through the windows, and then silence. Cold water. When I woke, my pillow was damp. On the small desk in my cabin lay a newspaper dated March 12, 1958, reporting the loss of a ferry called Aurora Sound that had vanished during a winter storm on the exact same route. Dozens were presumed dead. The names listed in the article matched the ones I'd seen on the manifest. After that, reality and dream began to blur. One morning, I found the dining room fully set for dinner service. Fresh bread, steaming coffee, gleaming silverware, though I hadn't seen anyone prepare it. Another time, I saw a woman in a 1940s coat standing at the end of the hall. When I called out to her, she turned, smiled faintly, and vanished into the bulkhead like smoke. By what I counted as the third or fourth day, I met the captain. He was tall and thin, his uniform faded to a ghostly gray. His eyes were kind but distant. "When will we reach Prince Rupert?" I asked. My voice trembled. He regarded me for a long moment before answering softly. "Some voyages don't end where they're meant to. The Aurora serves those who never reached their harbor. Sometimes a living soul drifts aboard, someone meant to bear witness." He explained that the ship had been lost decades earlier during a violent storm. Some passengers never left. Time, he said, had folded in on itself here, creating a corridor between past and present. "You are safe," he added gently, "but you must remember what you've seen. These stories deserve to live." The next morning, I awoke to find my porthole filled with sunlight. The sea was calm and glassy. We were approaching land, a small port that looked like Prince Rupert yet felt wrong. The colors were muted, the air heavy, the buildings unfamiliar. Signs bore old names I recognized from photos of the town taken half a century ago. I disembarked, feeling dizzy and unsteady. The crew waved from the deck, all except the captain, who simply nodded once before the ferry turned and vanished into fog. The town was strangely quiet. I checked into a small inn where the woman at the front desk asked for my name and then froze. "Lena Hart?" she repeated softly. "That's strange. We had another Miss Hart stay here. In 1958, she pointed to a framed guest ledger behind her. There it was. L. Hart, room 3, departed by ferry, never returned. I left the inn that night and caught a small plane back to Vancouver. When I arrived, 2 full weeks had passed since I'd left Port Hardy. No one could explain where I'd been. The ferry's schedule showed no record of a delayed or missing crossing. The Aurora Sound had supposedly been decommissioned 10 years earlier. For years, I tried to rationalize it. Fatigue, hallucination, maybe a concussion from the storm. But when I began researching coastal ferry incidents, I found a chilling pattern. Strange reports of time slips, passengers vanishing, ships arriving days late, or travelers describing ghost crews who spoke in outdated accents. One article mentioned that the old Aurora Sound had been sighted multiple times after its recorded sinking, usually in fog, usually with only one passenger aboard. Locals called it the ferry between worlds. I never boarded a ferry again. But sometimes on winter nights when the wind blows from the northwest and the fog rolls in thick over the bay, I hear the distant moan of a ship's horn. It sounds old, too old. I like to think it's still out there somewhere between decades, carrying the lost toward the destination they never reached. Maybe still searching for a safe harbor. If you ever find yourself traveling alone along the northern coast, and you see a blue and white ferry approaching through the fog with no lights and no passengers visible, don't wave it down. Don't step aboard, because the Aurora Sound doesn't carry people anymore. It carries memories. It's a reminder that the sea never forgets. Every wave remembers the lives it's taken. Every storm holds whispers of the voices that called for help and were never answered. And sometimes the sea sends those voices back. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the gentle sway of that ship beneath my feet. I can still smell the salt, the oil, the cold air. I can still hear the captain's final words echoing in my mind. Not every journey ends where it began. Some voyages last forever. So if you hear that low horn in the distance on a winter night, think twice before following it. Because sometimes the ocean offers you passage, but never the way home. And remember, in the endless fog of the Pacific, time doesn't always flow forward. Sometimes it circles back, carrying with it every ghost that ever dared to cross. Stay vigilant, stay subscribed, and if you ever board the wrong ship, pray it's not the Aurora Sound.